Hi, Ron. We're Katie Cullis and Natasha Stahili from Yellow Ladybugs. And joining us today is Dr. Ross Greene. Dr. Ross Greene is a best-selling author and internationally renowned clinical psychologist. He is the originator of collaborative and active solutions approach towards behaviour, in other words, the CPS model, and his influential work is widely known throughout the world. And you may know him from his game-changing non-profit organisation, Lives in the Balance, and his books including The Explosive Child, Raising Humans, and Lost at School.
Dr. Greene is already a household name due to his paradigm-shifting approach to supporting children with challenging behaviours. Today, we are excited to really focus in on supporting our particular community of autistic young people whose challenges are perhaps less obvious and whose unmet needs are more hidden. We're going to ask Dr. Greene to take us on this journey with advice for parents and teachers on how to step away from focusing on changing behaviour and instead to work proactively with our young people to understand their unmet needs and to address or solve these problems, all with a dose of curiosity and empathy and not a reward chart or punishment in sight.
So Dr. Greene is a tremendous ally for our community, and we are so honoured to have you here today. Dr. Greene, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's jump straight into it. We're first going to cover up the key philosophy that underpins your work. And just briefly, if you can summarize your approach and explain the lens shift away from behavior modification that informs this approach.
Well, the mentality of the model is kids do well if they can. The belief that if this kid could do well, they would do well. But it also acknowledges that doing well is a subjective thing, and that doing well means something different for each kid. And that has to be defined differently for each kid, meaning we don't have the exact same expectations for every kid because every kid is different. So all that's good, right? The reason many people feel that kids do well if they can is a bit earth-shattering is because of an alternative philosophy that's been quite popular for a very long time called kids do well if they wanna. Two very different philosophies that are going to take you in two completely different directions. If you have a kids do well if they wanna mentality, and you have a kid who's not doing well, then you're probably going to be pointed toward interventions aimed at making a kid want to do well, namely rewarding and punishing. And what are you rewarding and punishing? Behavior. A big difference between the CPS model and many other modalities is that we aren't focused on the behavior and we aren't focused on modifying it. We are focused instead on the problems that are causing that behavior and solving them. Your difference here is not just in terms of what outcomes you're looking at, but what are you focused on as you're working with a kid? In CPS, we're not focused on the behavior. We simply view the concerning behavior as the signal, the fever, the means by which the kid is communicating. We've all heard the cliche, behavior is communication. What is concerning behavior communicating? That there's an expectation the kid is having difficulty meeting. And many people know this already, but we refer to those expectations the kid is having difficulty meeting as unsolved problems. Now I'll shut up for a few minutes.
Well, we actually will jump into our next question.
Yeah, look, honestly, it's music to our ears to hear you say that. And I think putting the child's well-being at the center of what is a positive outcome is what this is all about. So at Yellow Ladybugs, we have a particular focus on autistic girls and gender diverse young people whose needs are often very hidden. And so we would love to hear you talk a little bit more specifically about the hidden needs or the unmet needs that our young people in our community are experiencing. And just a quick sort of context, these are the children who often internalize their behavior and who aren't necessarily outwardly disruptive. We're talking about young people who've been calm, compliant, apparently regulated throughout their school day. In fact, their teacher says they're fine, but then they come home and fall into a heap. They let it all out, yelling, swearing, moody and aggressive, or they retreat and become withdrawn, nonverbal or frozen. On the surface, this looks like disrespectful, rude, defiant behaviour, or avoidance or sulking. But let's look deeper. What might be going on for the student at school? What could some of their unmet needs be? So based on your experience, how can we use the CPS model to address these needs, or as you would put it, these unsolved problems?
Well, here's what's interesting about your question. Yes, I'm hearing that the child you were describing looks angelic at school, but I'm also hearing that the kid decompensates when they get home. So the first thing we should say is that a very popular explanation for that scenario is that the folks at school have their act together and the folks at home don't. So let's not go there, right? But it's popular, just doesn't mean that it's true. But what you described about what the kid was looking like at home once they got there tells us that hidden may not be the best word to use, because what you were describing doesn't sound hidden at all to me. It sounds like a kid we would be very concerned about, a kid who is communicating through their concerning behavior, whether it is disruptive, aggressive, or more subdued, they're still communicating to us that something ain't right. We still have to figure out what ain't right. There are many kids who have unsolved problems at school, but hold it together at school and then decompensate when they get home. So just because the kid is decompensating when they get home doesn't mean that what they are communicating to us when they get home is specific to the home environment. Now notice the term I haven't been using is unmet needs. Now, that's not because I'm allergic to the concept of unmet needs. I'm sure that we all have unmet needs, and I've worked with many kids who had unmet needs. Two things about that, though. I find that unmet needs are more nebulous, more hypothetical, more subject to adult conjecture. I find that unsolved problems are much more specific and therefore easier to identify and therefore easier to work on. But here's point number two. So I tend to talk about unsolved problems, not unmet needs, just because of the specificity issue. The other thing is this. I was doing a talk last week. Where was I? And was wherever I was. And people are saying, what about the kids' unmet needs? And I said, what do you mean when you say unmet needs? And they were saying things like, the kid didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, or the kid is coming to school hungry. Well, those are actually unmet needs we can do something about. But life got more interesting when I started hearing that people felt that those unmet needs had to be met before we could start working on a kid's unsolved problems. That I do not agree with. When I was seeing that people were putting the unmet needs so front and center, very empathic, by the way, very caring, certainly no judgmental anything there, but the unmet need was so front and center that it's almost like they couldn't see the unsolved problems because they were so caught up in the unmet needs. So once again, I'm not allergic to unmet needs, not criticizing anything about unmet needs, just saying it shouldn't keep us from working on unsolved problems, which are much more specific anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. Love your take on that, because we do hear a lot about unmet needs. And I really like how you've bridged that gap into understanding the unsolved problems there. Maybe we can dig a little deeper and have this conversation around the unsolved problems, especially in our community where there's particularly challenging and distressing situations that often arise in our families. And the first of these, as an example, is parents often come to us and share that their young person is displaying internalized behaviours of concern, including self-harm, suicidal ideation, restricted eating. What's your thoughts there in those situations?
No different than my thoughts with any other concerning behaviors. Obviously, self-harm is more serious than crying. Restricted eating could end up being more serious than pouting or withdrawing. And not that any of those, all of those are signals, right? So I don't change my approach dramatically depending on the signal. A signal is a signal, especially in terms of what it communicates. What signals communicate is something ain't right. There's an expectation a kid is having difficulty meeting. So my approach is no different. We got problems we need to solve. We're watching very closely to make sure that these very concerning behaviors that you have mentioned resolve as we are solving those problems. If they don't, we're not there yet. We've got some more work to do. But I don't alter my approach based on the severity of a kid's behavior. Yes, I'm taking into account it's more scary, could be more dangerous. It might cause us to feel a greater sense of urgency. None of that's bad. But as it relates to what I'm going to do next, I'm going to solve the problems that are causing those behaviors.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. So another situation which we would love your view on is school refusal, or as we prefer to call it, school can't. This is a hot topic in Australian schools right now and requires a far more nuanced approach than simply saying that parents need to apply tough love to get their kids to school. We've heard you say that when children wake up knowing they have 20 to 30 expectations they can't meet, it's no wonder they don't want to get out of bed. So what is your advice for families who are in this situation right now?
School refusal is a tough one. It is an unsolved problem. It is still a kid who's having difficulty meeting a particular expectation. It is a kid who's having difficulty going to school, which is what our expectation is. And there's a good reason that the kid is having difficulty going to school. And I can promise you that whatever that reason is, tough love is not going to address. So, you know, it's so easy to say tough love. It's so easy. This is true in world affairs as well, but we'll stick to kids. It's so easy to push for a more muscular approach to something that isn't going well. So easy. Very counterproductive. But more importantly, once we find out what's making it hard for a kid to go to school, and that's the key, right? You're only going to get that information from the kid. If all we're doing is focusing on what we might call school refusal, here comes the big word, behavior, then tough love is going to make perfect sense. Rewards are going to make perfect sense. Punishment's going to make perfect sense. And in the midst of doing all of that, we still have absolutely no idea what's making it hard for the kid to go to school in the first place. And if we don't know what's making it hard for the kid to go to the school in the first place, it's not going to get addressed. And it's certainly not going to get addressed through tough love or a more muscular approach to school refusal.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I hope the people who have used that approach are tuning into it, because we do want to shift that perspective. And, you know, you talk about curiosity, empathy, and actually problem solving collaboratively actually with the student. Like we might make a lot of assumptions about what the problems are, but it's important to make those connections with your child as well, or your student, to see what's getting in the way or what those issues might be.
You know, there are a lot of, we were just talking to a reporter about this today. She's doing a story, if I remember correctly, on school suspension, another punitive, exclusionary, disciplinary action that is a response to behavior. And she was pointing out that what kids get suspended for most often is what she called willful noncompliance, right? She said, what do you think of that? I said, first of all, the word willful is a little loaded. Secondly, simply calling it willful noncompliance completely eliminates the focus on the context in which this so-called willful noncompliance is occurring. There's an unsolved problem there, and there's an expectation a kid is having difficulty meeting, and there's probably adults who are pushing the kid harder to meet that expectation. That's the context. That should actually be our focal point. But many folks only focus on what comes after the kid is having difficulty meeting the expectation, what this reporter was calling willful noncompliance, and then on what happens after the kid is willfully noncompliant, in this case, a suspension. And the point that I made is the point that I just made to you all. A suspension, if this kid's having difficulty reading a particular passage in class, and they're getting pushed hard to read it, and they're not able to read it, and then they become willfully noncompliant, and then they get suspended. Well, there's the sequence of events. If you're focused on the later part of that sequence of events, you've got it all wrong. If you're focused on the early part of that sequence of events, you've got it all right. And that is, the kid's having difficulty completing the reading assignment. Let's solve that and then see if the kid is still willfully noncompliant. I'm gonna put my money on problem solving, not a suspension.
Totally. We're all on board on that. And actually that leads us into the next question, because we know we have an amazing community of educators watching this who are genuinely trying to change their classrooms, but who are bound by an inflexible system that largely adheres to these old methods of behaviour management. And we know you often advocate for individual schools to pilot the CPS model as a way of encouraging systemic change. But we're curious today, we would love to put the power directly into the hands of our teachers. What advice do you have for teachers who want to introduce the CPS model or other neuroaffirming trauma-informed approaches towards behaviour into their classroom? And how can we support them to bring about this change from the ground up?
My usual advice is to tell them to start a book study. Start a book study. And I've got the perfect book for a book study, as you might imagine.
Well, you know,
and that, by the way, me recommending a book study is not me being self-serving. It's just me knowing that that's a very good way to get the ball rolling, because you don't have to be alone. You can build this from the ground up. The book I would recommend is Lost at School. Full disclosure, that happens to be a book that I wrote. But once again, that's not about book sales. That's just about that being a very good way to get the ball rolling, to prompt discussions in schools that very badly need to be had, that help people examine their lenses. I would say that Lost at School is really good at helping people question their assumptions, question their beliefs, and then question their practices. There's all kinds of people in that book that people will find to be familiar characters in their school as well. I would start a book study, and I would invite the headmaster or principal or assistant headmaster or assistant principal to be a part of that book study, so that we have some decision makers involved there as well. Take this on as a building. Schools should be about constant improvement. Schools should be about being open-minded to change and self-examination, and are there things we could be doing better? They are often that way about academics. Why there is so much reluctance on behavior is beyond me, especially since I know that a very high percentage of behavior problems that occur in a school can be traced back in one way or another to academics anyways. So I don't have as easy a time as many people do separating behavior from academics. I think they go hand in glove. If you are open-minded to changing things for the better on academics, finding new ways of teaching things, finding new ways of engaging kids, you should also be open-minded to new ways of helping kids, and especially the ones that we've been losing all along.
Yeah, and our community, especially the Yellow Ladybugs community, we're known as the lost girls who are so lost in the system. So that ties in beautifully to that book, and we definitely recommend it, and we'll put a link to the book as part of this. And we're also releasing our own book, which is autistic led, called How to Support Autistic girls and gender diverse students at school. So maybe after that book, you can add in our book to your reading list for the teachers listening at home.
Yes.
So we'll jump into the next question.
Yeah. So we know you've spoken a lot about changing the lens on behaviour as a personal journey. For example, you yourself were trained in behaviourism originally. So this lens shift is where we know we can make the most impact, and we really want to help people move forwards with their approach towards behaviour and to evolve their thinking. And after all, when we know better, we do better. So what is your advice to parents, educators, or even health professionals who are still stuck? How do we own our mistakes, and how do we move from rupture to repair? Big question.
Well, I think that my answer is no different than it would be in a school. As parents, hopefully we are open to new ways of doing things. I haven't come across any parents who didn't want to be the best parent they could be. I haven't come across any educators who didn't want to be the best educator they could be. I've come across a lot of frustrated parents and a lot of frustrated educators. And what were they frustrated about? What they were doing now wasn't working. Now, there's two approaches to what you're doing now isn't working. You can do more of it in hopes that it might someday work, or you can take a look at what you're doing, access information that might help you move in another direction. That depends a little bit on how open-minded people are. It depends a little bit on the resources that are available to them. It depends a little bit on their savvy in finding resources if they don't find them immediately. So I think it's complicated, but I don't think that the answer is any different than it would be with a school. If things are not going well with you and your kid, start trying to figure out why. Start reading books that might help you, and be willing to acknowledge that what you're doing now isn't working. It may have even, quote unquote, worked for one of your kids, but it isn't working for this one. No reason to believe that what worked for one kid is going to work for the other. Actually, no reason to believe that what you think worked for you when you were a kid is going to work for your kids now. I think the main ingredient here is being open-minded and being willing to try on new ideas for size.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Beautiful advice. And we're going to finish off today and ask you one question. If there's anything you want to say to our young ladybugs listening at home, the collaborative part of your model is so important, and it gives our children voice and agency. And we know you believe this is so important to involve our children in the process and to do so from a place of curiosity and empathy, which we love. So what's your message to any young people who are watching today?
Ask the kid. Listen to the kid. So many meetings I sit in, including numerous this week and last, where the adults are getting together to talk about the kid, talking about everything that's going wrong. And at no point have they asked the kid what's getting in their way. Ask the kid, listen to the kid, engage the kid in the process of solving the problems that are affecting their lives. For me, that's the definition of accountability. For many, many people, accountability means adult-imposed consequences. Add more pain. First of all, I don't even think that's accountability. You want to help a kid be accountable, engage them in the process of solving the problems that are affecting their lives. Give them voice, give them agency. Ask the kid, listen to the kid, engage the kid. Otherwise, you still won't have the slightest idea what's getting in the kid's way.
Such a beautiful point. And we hear from adults who are now gone through this approach, the trauma that it's had on them when they've not had an opportunity to have their voice and agency. So the impact and the cost is huge. Even if you think in the moment you might be getting somewhere, at what cost to them? So that is just such an incredibly powerful perspective.
Yeah.
We are so grateful for your time today, and thank you so much. Hopefully we can get this message spread out to as many people as possible. through this conference and beyond. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us